Hey there, my name is Yulia and I'm a plant evolutionary biologist by training. And in my free time, I'm passionate about gardening, and recently I've become fascinated by botanical symbolism. So here we are in this channel to explore how flowers became words. So, you know, flowers actually have been used as a secret language for centuries, and the idea of showing our emotions and talking about our feelings as openly as we do right now, that is actually quite new. So before that, people embedded emotions into carefully selected bouquets. For example, a single flower could declare love, request forgiveness, or even issue warnings. And as a scientist, I'm really interested in exploring the surprising ways in which plants are connected to human culture. So let's dive into the story. Now, most people think that flower language started in Victorian England, which is completely wrong. The practice actually emerged independently across virtually every single major civilization. Humans everywhere have assigned meanings to flowers. For example, ancient Egyptians linked lotus flowers with rebirth and placed them in tombs. In Greek mythology, there was Aphrodite, who was connected to roses, which established the romantic symbolism, and which is still persistent for like thousands of years. And then in China, flower symbolism has existed also for millennia. For example, peonies there represented wealth, honor, and power. And the plum blossoms, because it blooms in winter, it symbolized resilience and hope. And actually, those were not just pretty associations. Those are things that were deeply embedded into the poetry, art, and the social customs. In Japan, of course, they developed their own language, their own flower language, which is called hanakotoba, and which literally means flower words. And the system was sophisticated and specific, with meaning attached not only to flower types, but also to colors and even how blooms were presented. And in the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish practice of selam used flowers as a part of the elaborate, how would you say it, communication game. So people would exchange objects, for example, flowers, fruits, herbs, feathers, that connected to the specific rhyming verses, and the receiver had to decode the message by finding the correct poem. So basically it was this creative, poetic, and deeply tied to the Turkish literary tradition. And during the medieval Europe, of course, when the Christianity came, that flowers took on the Christian spiritual meanings. So before we even get to the Victorian England, flower symbolism existed across ancient Egypt, classical Greece, China, Japan, Ottoman Empire, and the medieval Europe. So every culture found ways to make flowers speak, basically. And European knowledge of Eastern flower communication comes largely from one particular woman, and there is a really interesting and fascinating cross-cultural misunderstanding. So her name was Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, and she was an English aristocrat, and she went to Constantinople with her husband, who was appointed as a British ambassador in Turkey. And during her time there, she encountered selam firsthand. So now remember, selam was actually this game where objects connected to the rhyming verses. So the receiver decoded the messages through poetry. It was clever, literally, and very specific to the Turkish culture. But Montagu interpreted it differently. She saw it as a direct symbolic language where each flower inherently meant something specific. No poems, no context needed, just flower equals meaning. And then she wrote really enthusiastically about it to friends back in England, and her letters described selam as this beautiful, elaborate, coded flower language where women could communicate their passion, friendships, and warnings without writing a single word. So that interpretation was not super accurate, but what is interesting that it absolutely captured European imagination. Victorian England took Montagu's romanticized version and just ran with it. And then the 19th century created the strict demands for emotional expression, particularly between unmarried people. So this is where our flower language came in use. So you couldn't just tell anybody that you liked them. It would be really scandalous and inappropriate. So flowers became the solution. And this created a huge demand for knowing what each flower meant. So between 1820s and 1850s, publisher released dozens of flower language dictionaries. And these particularly important ones shaped how we understand flower language today. So in 1819, Charlotte de la Tour published La Langue des Fleurs, I don't know if I pronounce it correctly, in French. And this established basic symbolic associations and created actually the blueprint for European floriography systems. It became wildly popular. Then there was another significant one in 1830s. Russian poet Dmitry Oznobishin published Selam, or the language of flowers. And what is interesting that despite the title, he apparently drew more from German Blumensprache than the actual authentic Turkish practices. Here's something crucial to understand. The same flower can mean completely different things depending on which culture you're in. So let me show you what I mean with these chrysanthemums from my garden. All right, it's a little bit gloomy today, but here's the garden, here we go. So here are the beautiful chrysanthemums. It's end of October and those are the only flowers left. Mostly I have some dahlias, but otherwise that's it. So with this example, I wanted to tell you that, for example, in Victorian England, chrysanthemums, in some of the dictionaries, it is said that they symbolize friendship and some positive connotation was given, but in the other dictionaries it was something that you bring to funeral. Very confusing, right? If you want to actually send the chrysanthemums to declare your friendship to somebody and the person has understood it as a very different meaning. While, for example, in China, chrysanthemum was flower of the honor and not everybody, for example, was allowed to have it in their houses because it was really honorable flower to have. In other traditions, for example, in Italy and Malta, it was considered to be bad luck to have the chrysanthemums in the house. Same flower, three completely different meanings. Why? Because symbolic systems develop within specific cultural contexts. They're not universal, they're not based on some inherent property of the flower itself. And it gets even more complicated. These Victorian dictionaries constantly contradicted each other. For example, I have here the books, and then, so this one is supposed to be Victorian language of flowers. And when I look for the chrysanthemum, it says meaning condolences, that it is used in funerals and placed on graves in many countries in Europe. Illustrated guide to the Victorian language of flowers. All right, now, if we take another complete language of flowers book, there it says that chrysanthemum is more about the cheerfulness, fidelity, happiness. Nothing about condolences. One book would say yellow roses meant jealousy. Another claimed they symbolized friendship. The third insisted they represented dying love. You can imagine the confusion that caused. And this happened because the system weren't really based on universal botanical properties. They were cultural inventions drawing from different different sources: mythology, medieval Grecian symbolism, folk traditions, even the personal preferences of dictionary authors. So Victorian floriography was really multiple competing systems, all claiming authority simultaneously. And today we still use remnants of this symbolic system: red roses for romance on Valentine's Day, white lilies on funerals. We have kept some meaning while others have completely disappeared. But what interests me as a botanist is how these symbolic associations reveal something about human relationship with plants. We've always needed flowers to carry meanings beyond their biological functions. Different cultures created different flower languages because they had different flowers availability, different social needs, different aesthetic traditions. There was never one universal flower language. There were many flower languages, all equally valid within their own contexts. So that's the brief introductory story how flowers became words. It's messier and more complicated than the simple Victorian romance we often imagine. It involves multiple ancient traditions, cultural exchange, creative misinterpretation, and competing symbolic system. So next time we'll look at another specific flower and trace how its meaning changed across different cultures and time periods. So until then, pay attention to flowers around you. They might be speaking flower languages we've forgotten. Thanks for watching Botanical Symbolism, and I'll see you next time.